A storm raged across Sunnydale that fateful night, but the real tempest was inside Jackson Reynolds' mind. The former Marine was battling his own demons when he spotted her through the driving rain, a German shepherd heavily pregnant and chained to the old bridge, the rising waters inches from claiming her life. What happened in the next few desperate hours would shake an entire community to its core. Neither could have known they were forging a bond that would challenge the town's most powerful man and inspire a broken veteran to rise against overwhelming odds. Dakota was abandoned to die, but instead became the salvation of a wounded warrior. When Edward Sinclair, the man responsible for chaining her to the bridge, returned to claim the purebred puppies, no one expected Jackson's response, a stand so powerful it left everyone in tears. This is the story of a pregnant German shepherd, 7 tiny miracles, and the broken soldier who found redemption protecting them, transforming not just his life but an entire town in the process. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rain pounded against the window panes of Jackson Reynolds' small cabin on the outskirts of Sunnydale. The clock on his nightstand read 2:17 a.m., but sleep remained a distant dream. The former Marine sat on the edge of his bed, his scarred hands trembling slightly as thunder crashed overhead. Each rumble sent him back to places he'd spent years in trying to forget, dusty streets exploding, buildings the cries of wounded comrades. Not tonight, Jackson muttered, pushing himself to his feet. His leg ached where shrapnel had torn through it. 3 years ago, a constant reminder of his final mission. The nightmares had been worse this week, the anniversary of the ambush that had taken 4 of his squad members and left him with both visible and invisible scars. Physical therapy had helped with his leg. The PTSD was another matter entirely. Jackson pulled on a raincoat and limped to the front door. The doctor had recommended walking when the memories became too intense, even in a storm. It beat the alternative, sitting alone with the ghosts that haunted him. The rain was relentless, drumming against his hood as he made his way down the muddy path that led from his isolated cabin toward Cedar Creek. The swollen waters of the creek roared in the darkness. Usually a gentle stream, now transformed into something dangerous by the 3 days of continuous rainfall. Jackson's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. He'd made this walk hundreds of times since moving to Sunnydale, after his medical discharge, seeking solitude away from the well-meaning but suffocating concern of others out. Here no one flinched when he jumped at sudden noises. No one saw the cold sweats or the vacant stares when memories overtook him. The old wooden bridge came into view, the planks slick with rain. Jackson paused, shining his light across the structure. The creek had risen significantly, water now lapping at the underside of the bridge. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong among the rain and thunder. A whimper, high, pitched and desperate. Jackson frowned, sweeping his flashlight across the bridge again. The beam caught something that made his blood run cold halfway across the bridge. A large dog was chained to the triling, the rising water already reaching its legs. "What the hell?" Jackson whispered, breaking into a halting run as he drew closer. He could see it was a German shepherd. Its tan and black coat soaked through the dog's eyes reflected his flashlight, wide with terror. A heavy chain had been wrapped multiple times around its neck, and the bridge railing secured with a padlock. The animal pulled desperately against its restraint, each movement only tightening the chain's grip. "Easy, easy," Jackson said, approaching slowly, his voice fighting to remain calm despite the rage building inside him. "I'm here to help you." The dog growled weakly, baring its teeth before another whimper escaped as Jackson's light moved over the animal's body. He realized with shock that the German shepherd was female and heavily pregnant, her swollen belly obvious even in the dim light. "Who would do this?" Jackson murmured, kneeling despite the pain in his leg. The water from the creek was now flowing over the bridge, in places rising by the minute. If he didn't act quickly, the dog would drown along with her unborn puppies. The German shepherd growled again as he reached toward her, then seemed to relent as if understanding his intent. Her eyes, amber in the flashlight beam, watched him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jackson promised. Examining the chain, the padlock was solid, impossible to break without tools. The chain itself was wrapped too tightly to slip over the dog's head. Jackson glanced at the rising water, then back at the frightened animal, making a decision. He shrugged off his raincoat and wrapped it around his hand, taking firm hold of the railing with his other hand. He began working to loosen one of the wooden slats where the chain was attached. The wood was old, softened by years of weather, and the current downpour. Jackson strained, putting all his weight into rocking the slat back and forth. The dog watched, trembling from cold, and fear occasionally pulling against the chain, as if trying to help just a little more. Jackson grunted. Feeling the wood begin to splinter. With a final heave, the slat broke free, allowing the chain to slip through. The dog was still chained, but no longer bound to the bridge. Jackson gathered the length of chain in his hands and knelt beside the German shepherd. "I need you to trust me," he said softly, reaching out slowly to touch her rain-soaked fur. The dog stiffened but didn't bite. Instead, making a soft whining sound that tugged at something deep in Jackson's chest with careful movements. He gathered the dog in his arms chain and all struggling against the pain in his leg as he lifted her. "I've got you," he whispered as the German shepherd trembled against him. "I've got you." The walk back to his cabin was grueling. The dog was heavy, especially with the added weight of her pregnancy, and the sodden chain. Twice Jackson nearly fell in the mud, his injured leg threatening to give way each time he adjusted his grip and pressed on, driven by the desperate seed in the animal's eyes. By the time they reached his cabin, Jackson's muscles were screaming in protest. He shouldered open the door and carried the German shepherd inside, setting her down gently on the rug. "Before the cold fireplace, let's get you warm," he said quickly, building a fire from the stacked wood beside the hearth as flames began to catch, casting flickering light across the small room. Jackson got his first good look at the dog. She was thin beneath her wet fur, her ribs visible despite her pregnancy. The chain had rubbed raw patches on her neck, some bleeding slightly. Despite her condition, she had the dignified bearing of a purebred, her face intelligent and watchful. "What's your story, girl?" Jackson asked, retrieving his emergency first aid kit. The dog's eyes followed his every movement, but she made no attempt to run or attack, instead remaining where he had placed her. Shivering music occasionally, Jackson found bolt cutters in his toolbox and carefully approached the German shepherd. "I'm going to get this off you," he explained, speaking in the same calm, even tone he'd use with a frightened civilian in a combat zone. "It might hurt a little, but then you'll be free." The dog seemed to understand, holding still as Jackson worked to cut through the links of chain one by one. When the last link parted and the heavy chain fell away, the German shepherd shook herself, then looked up at Jackson with what seemed almost like gratitude. "You need a name," Jackson said gently, examining the raw wounds on her neck. "How about Dakota? You look like a Dakota to me." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Jackson cleaned Dakota's wounds as best he could, his combat medical training proving useful. He found a blanket and laid it before the fire, then filled a bowl with water and another with some leftover chicken from his dinner. Dakota approached the food, cautiously sniffed, then began to eat with increasing enthusiasm. Jackson sat on the floor nearby, giving her space while keeping a concerned eye on her condition. "I should call someone." He said more to himself than to the dog. "A vet animal control someone who knows about." He gestured toward her swollen belly. Dakota finished eating and drinking, then turned in a circle on the blanket before lying down with a heavy sigh. Her eyes remained on Jackson as if afraid he might disappear, or worse, chain her up again. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her, stretching out his bad leg with a wince. "And neither are you, not tonight anyway." The rain continued to bound against the roof as Dakota's eyes began to drift closed, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. Jackson watched as her breathing steadied, feeling a curious sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before his injury. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the few local contacts he had. Most people in Sunnydale considered him the strange, reclusive veteran who kept to himself. He preferred it that way, but now with a pregnant dog rescued from certain death, he needed help. The name Dr. Natalie Brooks glowed on his screen. GRE, the local veterinarian, had helped Jackson once before. When he'd found an injured hawk near his property, she hadn't asked unnecessary questions or made awkward attempts at conversation about his service, just treated the hawk, given him instructions for its care, and left him alone. He depreciated that Jackson glanced at the clock, nearly 4 a.m. Now too early to call. Dakota seemed stable for the moment, breathing evenly as she rested before the fire. He'd call the vet at first light. His hand drifted to the dog's head, gently stroking her in damp fur. Dakota stirred slightly, pressing her muzzle against his palm before settling back into sleep. "Who did this to you?" Jackson whispered, anger flaring again at the thought of someone deliberately chaining a pregnant dog to a bridge during a flood, and why Dakota had no answers. Only a soft sigh as the warmth of the fire slowly penetrated her chilled body. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the small cabin, Jackson felt something shift for the first time in years. The ghosts of his past had retreated, pushed aside by the immediate needs of the creature before him. The restlessness that had driven him out into the storm had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a determination to protect this vulnerable animal, who had been a cast aside to die. Jackson settled back against the wall, prepared to keep vigil through what remained of the night. His leg ached and fatigue pulled at him, but he fought it off, unwilling to sleep while Dakota might need him. "We made it through tonight," he told the sleeping dog. "We'll figure out tomorrow when it comes." He didn't know then how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how the simple act of rescuing a dog would set in motion events that would change not only his life but the entire town of Sunnydale. In the quiet of his cabin, with rain drumming on the roof and a rescued German shepherd sleeping peacefully before his fire, Jackson Reynolds had taken the first step on a journey that would lead him places he never expected to go, including back to himself, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Dakota's breathing suddenly changed. She raised her head, a low whine escaping her throat. Jackson, who had been drifting in and out of a light doze, was immediately alert. "What is it, girl?" he asked, moving closer. Dakota struggled to her feet, turning in an anxious circle before lying down again. Her sides heaved with labored breathing, her eyes wide with what Jackson recognized as panic. "Oh no," he murmured, realization dawning. "Not now." Dakota whined again, more urgently this time, her amber eyes fixed on Jackson's face as if pleading for help. "The puppies were coming. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Jackson's heart raced as he fumbled for his phone. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed Dr. Brooks' number, knowing full well the early hour but seeing no alternative. Dakota's breathing had become increasingly labored, her sides heaving with contractions. "Hello," a groggy voice answered on the fourth ring. "Dr. Brooks, this is Jackson Reynolds. I'm sorry to call so early, but I have an emergency." There was a rustle of movement, and when Natalie spoke again, her voice was more alert. "What kind of emergency, Mr. Reynolds?" "I found a German shepherd last night chained to the bridge over Cedar Creek. She's pregnant, and I think she's in labor now." "She's with you?" Natalie asked, professional concern replacing any annoyance at the early call. "Yes, at my cabin. Someone had left her to drown in the flood." A sharp intake of breath came through the phone. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. In the meantime, find clean towel and something to cut the umbilical cord, scissors or string, and keep her calm." Jackson sat down the phone and knelt beside Dakota, who was panting heavily now. Her eyes wide with fear locked onto his. "Help is coming," he promised, stroking her head gently. "You're going to be okay." He gathered towels from the bathroom along with scissors and string from his first aid kit. As he laid these supplies near Dakota, she suddenly stiffened, a low moan escaping her as the first contraction hit in. "Ernest, easy, girl," Jackson murmured, his combat experience kicking in. He'd never delivered puppies before, but he'd helped with emergency field medicine enough to understand the basics of birth. "Just breathe through it," Dakota whimpered, turning herself in a circle before settling again on the blanket. Jackson remained beside her, one hand stroking her flank, the other checking his watch, timing the contractions as they came closer together. Outside, the storm had subsided to a steady drizzle, the first light of dawn casting weak shadows through the windows. Jackson found himself speaking softly to Dakota, telling her about his cabin, his life, anything to keep his voice steady and reassuring. "I've been here 2 years now," he said, as Dakota panted through another contraction. "It's quiet. That's what I needed after everything." Her amber eyes remained fixed on his face, as if drawing strength from his presence. Another contraction hit more powerful than the last, and Dakota cried out, "You're doing great." Jackson encouraged, though. Anxiety knotted his stomach. What if something went wrong? What if the puppies were in distress? What if a knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts? "Mr. Reynolds?" "It's Dr. Brooks, come in," he called. Relief flooding through him, the door opened and Natalie Brooks entered, her auburn hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Dressed in jeans and a sweater with a raincoat thrown over top, she carried a large medical bag which she set down as she quickly assessed the situation. "How long has she been in active labor?" she asked, moving to kneel beside Dakota, the German shepherd, tensed at the stranger's approach but remained still. Her trust in Jackson apparently extending to anyone he allowed in about 15 minutes since the first strong contraction. Jackson replied, "Getting closer together." Now Natalie nodded her examination. "Gentle but thorough, she's malnourished and dehydrated but otherwise appears healthy. The first puppy's coming soon. You said she was chained to the bridge." Jackson noted grimly. Padlocked, had to break the railing to get her free. Someone wanted her to drown. Natalie's expression hardened some people. She didn't finish the sentence, instead focusing on Dakota. "Here we go," she said as Dakota's body tensed with another powerful contraction. "The first one's coming." Jackson watched in amazement as Dakota strained, and the first tiny puppy emerged, slick and dark. Natalie worked quickly, clearing its mouth and nose, rubbing it vigorously with a towel, until a small squeak indicated the puppy was breathing. "A boy," she announced, placing the tiny creature near Dakota's head. The mother dog immediately began cleaning her offspring, her tongue gently washing the newborn now for the siblings. Natalie said, preparing for the next arrival. This could go on for hours. First litters can be unpredictable, but Dakota seemed determined to bring her puppies into the world efficiently. Within the next 2 hours, 6 more puppies had joined the first 3 more males and 3 females. Each time Natalie ensured the puppy was breathing before placing it in Dakota, who cleaned each one with the same gentle attention. 7 puppies, Natalie said. Finally sitting back on her heels after the last arrival, she's done well, especially considering her condition. She began examining each puppy, checking for abnormalities or breathing issues. They seem healthy. Though the last female is quite small, we'll need to keep an eye on her. Dakota lay exhausted but alert, her newborn puppies now nursing contentedly. She looked up at Jackson, something like pride in her gaze. "You did all the work," he told her softly. "I just provided the location." Natalie was packing her supplies, her clinical gaze evaluating the puppies and their mother. "She needs proper food high in calcium and protein. The puppies should be fine nursing, but we'll need to supplement if the runt doesn't gain weight." She handed Jackson the list she'd quickly scribbled. "These supplies will get you through the next few days. Thank you for coming so quickly," Jackson said, reaching for his wallet. "What do I owe you?" Natalie waved him off. "This one's on the house. Anyone who rescues a pregnant dog from drowning deserves a little professional courtesy." She hesitated, then asked, "What are your plans for her and the puppies?" The question caught Jackson off guard. He hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis. I don't know. I suppose I should call animal control. Sunnydale's shelter is overcrowded already," Natalie said, a note of concern in her voice. "And with 7 puppies. Well, their policies on space issues aren't always ideal." Jackson looked at Dakota peacefully nursing her puppies, seemingly secure. For the first time since he'd found her, something protective stirred in his chest. What would happen to them at the shelter? Natalie's expression was carefully neutral. Best case, they'd be adopted separately. Worst case, the shelter has limited resources. Understanding dawned on Jackson. They'd be put down. It's a possibility, especially for the mother. Older dogs are harder to place. Natalie knelt to check the smallest puppy again. "You could keep them until the puppies are weaned, 8 weeks minimum. That would give us time to find homes." "I don't know anything about caring for puppies," Jackson said, though even as he spoke he found himself unwilling to consider the alternative. Natalie smiled for the first time that morning. "You figured out how to rescue a pregnant dog from a flooding bridge in the middle of the night. I think you can handle feeding schedules," she wrote. Her cell number on the supply list. "Call me if you have questions. I can stop by in a few days to check on them." After Natalie left, Jackson sat beside Dakota, watching the tiny puppies nursing 7 new lives brought into the world under his roof. Lives that would have been lost if he hadn't been walking in the storm last night. Looks like you're staying. And for a while he told Dakota, who responded with a contented sigh, her eyes drifting closed in exhausted sleep. Jackson realized he should be exhausted too. He'd been up all night, first with his nightmares, then the rescue, and finally the birth. Yet he felt more alert, more present than he had in months. There was something anchoring about having another creature depend on him. Something that pulled him out of the swirling darkness of his memories as the morning light strengthened. Filtering through the windows of his small cabin, Jackson made Dakota and her puppies a makeshift nest from a large wooden crate lined with blankets. He carefully transferred the sleeping puppies first, then helped Dakota move to the new bed. She inspected it thoroughly, turned in a circle, then settled with her babies, giving Jackson's hand a grateful lick rest. Now he told her, "You've earned it," while Dakota slept. Jackson made a quick trip to town for the supplies Natalie had listed. Sunnydale was a small community just over 5,000 people with a main street of modest shops and a general atmosphere of everyone knowing everyone else's business. It was partly why Jackson had chosen cabins so far from town, to avoid the curious looks and awkward conversations. The local market was just opening when he arrived. Inside, he found most of the items on Natalie's list filling his cart with puppy formula, special food for nursing mothers, additional blankets, and a few chew toys. As he checked out, the young cashier, her name tag read. Amy raised her eyebrows at his purchases. Getting a dog. Mr. Reynolds. Jackson wasn't surprised she knew his name in Sunnydale. The wounded veteran who lived alone in the woods was something of a local curiosity. Something like that, he replied, not wanting to elaborate. Amy seemed eager to continue the conversation. My sister works at the animal shelter. They've got lots of nice dogs if you're looking. I've already found one, thanks, Jackson said, gathering his bags. He nodded politely and headed for the door, but not before noticing several other customers watching him with undisguised interest. Gossip traveled fast in small towns. By noon, most of Sunnydale would know Jackson Reynolds had bought dog supplies when he returned to the cabin. Dakota was awake, cleaning her puppies with methodical care. She looked up as Jackson entered, her tail thumping against the blankets in greeting. Brought you some proper food, he told her, setting out a bowl of the specialized kibble Natalie had recommended. Dakota sniffed it appreciatively but seemed reluctant to leave her puppies. It's okay, Jackson said, moving the bowl closer to her nest. You can eat and keep an eye on them at the same time, as if understanding. Dakota began to eat, her eyes still watchful over her newborns. Jackson took the opportunity to examine each puppy more carefully. 7 tiny bundles, eyes still closed, making small mewing sounds as they squirmed against each other. The smallest, the runt Natalie had mentioned, was noticeably smaller than her siblings but seemed to be breathing normally. You've got quite a family here, Dakota, he said. Settling into a chair near the nest, the events of the last 12 hours caught up with him, suddenly exhaustion washing over him in a powerful wave. His eyelids grew heavy as he watched Dakota return to her puppy, after eating for the first time in longer than he could remember. Jackson fell asleep without fear of nightmares. He awoke to the sound of his phone ringing. Disoriented, he fumbled for it. Noting that several hours had passed, Dakota watched him alertly from her nest, all puppies accounted for and sleeping peacefully. Hello, Jackson answered, his voice rough with sleep. Mr. Reynolds, this is Sergeant Leo C. with the Sunnydale Police Department. Dr. Brooks contacted us about a dog you rescued last night. Jackson straightened in his chair. Yes, that's right. I'd like to come out and take a statement if that's convenient. Abandoning an animal in life, threatening circumstances, is a felony in this state. Jackson hesitated, looking at Dakota. The last thing he wanted was more people invading his privacy. But the thought of whoever had chained Dakota to that bridge going unpunched made his jaw clench with anger. Of course, officer, I can describe where I found her excellent wood this afternoon. Work around 3. Jackson agreed and ended the call, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within him. His solitary existence had been thoroughly disrupted in less than a day, first by Dakota and her puppies, now by involvement with local authorities. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret any of it. Looks like we're going to have company, he told Dakota, who responded by checking each of her puppies in turn, her maternal instincts impressive for a first-time mother. Jackson used the hours before the officer's arrival to make his cabin more presentable and to construct a more permanent whelping box for Dakota using some spare lumber. He worked methodically, finding a forgotten satisfaction in the simple task of building something useful. When a police cruiser pulled up outside just before 3, Dakota raised her head alertly but didn't bark. Jackson limped to the door, his legs stiff from the previous nights. Exertion Sergeant Campbell was a solidly built man in his early 40s with a weathered face and observant eyes that took in Jackson's cabin and Jackson himself with professional assessment. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, extending a hand, "thanks for seeing. Me mind if I come in?" Jackson stepped back, allowing the officer inside. Campbell immediately noticed Dakota and her puppies, his expression softening. "So this is our rescue case," he said. Approaching slowly and kneeling at a respectful distance, Dakota watched him cautiously but without aggression. "Dr. Brooks told me what happened, mind walking me through it." Jackson described finding Dakota chained to the bridge, the rising waters, and his efforts to free her. Campbell took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "You mentioned a padlock," the officer said. "Any marking or distinctive features?" Jackson shook his head. "Standard combination lock. As far as I could tell in the dark, I left it attached to the chain when I cut her free. And the chain heavy-duty, the kind you might use to secure a gate or valuable equipment." Campbell nodded. "Writing something in his notebook. Any idea who might have done this?" "None. I keep to myself." "Mostly." Jackson hesitated, then added, "Dakota is obviously purebred and in good condition. Apart from the recent neglect, someone paid good money for her." Dakota, Campbell asked with raised eyebrows. Jackson felt a flush of embarrassment. "I had to call her something." A smile briefly crossed Campbell's face. "It suits her." He closed his notebook. "I'd like to take a look at the bridge where you found her, if you're willing to show me." The request surprised Jackson. Now, if that's convenient, evidence tends to disappear quickly in weather like we had last night. Jackson glanced at Dakota, reluctant to leave her and the puppies alone so soon. After their ordeal, Campbell seemed to understand his hesitation. It would take long. These cases can be hard to prove without physical evidence. "All right," Jackson agreed. "Let me just make sure Dakota has fresh water and food before we go." As he prepared to leave, Jackson found himself talking softly to Dakota, explaining that he would return soon. She watched him with those intelligent eyes, then settled more deeply into her nest, as if accepting his temporary music absence. The drive to Cedar Creek Bridge was short, but uncomfortable for Jackson. He rarely rode in cars anymore. The enclosed space and lack of control triggered his anxiety, and being in a police cruiser added another layer of tension. He focused on his breathing, using techniques his therapist had taught him before he'd stopped attending sessions. The bridge looked different in daylight, less menacing but still bearing the marks of the previous night's drama. The water level had receded significantly, though. The creek still ran swift and brown with silt. Campbell parked and they walked onto the bridge. Jackson pointed out the broken railing slat where he'd freed Dakota. "Here," he said, indicating the splintered wood the chain was wrapped around this section. Campbell examined the area carefully, then began a methodical search of the bridge and its approaches. Jackson watched, impressed by the officer's thoroughness. "Anything specific we're looking for?" he asked. Campbell knelt, examining something on the ground. "Tire tracks, footprints, anything that might identify whoever brought a dog out here in the middle of the night." The officer's radio crackled suddenly, a dispatcher's voice requesting his location. "I'm at Cedar Creek Bridge," Campbell responded. Following up on the animal abandonment case, there was a pause. Then the dispatch spoke again, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Be advised. We've received a report of stolen property from Edward Sinclair, a German Shepherd breeding female valued at 115 sorts on a bro." Campbell's eyes met Jackson's, a silent understanding passing between them. "Roger that," Campbell replied. "Tell Mr. Sinclair I'll be in touch shortly," as he clipped the radio back to his belt. Campbell's expression had hardened. "Edward Sinclair, said is the wealthiest man in Sunnydale, owns half the commercial property in town, including the building that houses our police station." He looked back toward his cruiser, and apparently he's missing a very valuable German Shepherd. Jackson felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Dakota isn't stolen property. She was abandoned to die, I believe you," Campbell said, his voice low. "But Sinclair has influence in this town. This just got complicated as they returned to the cruiser Jackson's. Mind raced. He had rescued Dakota, helped deliver her puppies, begun to form a bond with the abandoned animal. The thought of returning her to someone who had chained her to a bridge during a flood made his blood boil. "What happens now?" he asked as Campbell started the engine. The officer was silent for a moment, his expression troubled officially. "I need to investigate Mr. Sinclair's claim." Unofficially, he glanced at Jackson. "I suggest you make sure your doors are locked tonight. Sunnydale can be a small town with a long memory, especially when Edward Sinclair is involved." As they drove back toward his cabin, Jackson felt the familiar weight of combat awareness settling over him, the heightened senses, the strategic assessment, the preparation for a conflict. Only this time, it wasn't enemy combatants he was preparing to face, but a wealthy businessman in a small town where Jackson was already an outsider. Dakota and her puppies had just entered his life, but already Jackson knew with absolute certainty he would not let them go without a fight the morning after Sergeant Campbell's visit. Jackson woke to the sound of soft whimpering for a moment. Disorientation gripped him. The sound was unfamiliar, not part of his usual nightmares. Then memory flooded back as he glanced toward the whelping box where Dakota lay nursing her puppies. The smallest female, the runt, was struggling to latch, pushed aside by her stronger siblings without thinking. Jackson moved to the box and gently lifted the tiny puppy, cradling her in his palm. "Having trouble there, little one," he murmured, stroking her with one finger. Dakota watched, alert, but trusting, as Jackson helped the runt find a place to nurse. The domesticity of the moment struck him suddenly. 3 days ago, his isolated existence had consisted of avoiding people, fighting nightmares, and simply enduring each day. Now, his cabin contained 8 new lives that depended on him. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Dakota's ears pricked forward, her body tensing protectively over her puppies. Jackson moved to the window, bracing himself for Sinclair or the police, but instead saw Dr. Brooks' modest sedan pulling up. "It's okay," he told Dakota. "She's here to help." He opened the door as Natalie approached, carrying her medical bag and what looked like a bag of groceries. "Morning," she said brightly. "Thought I'd check how everyone's doing and bring you some breakfast. You probably haven't had much time to cook." The gesture caught Jackson off guard. "That's very thoughtful." Natalie smiled, stepping past him into the cabin. "Professional courtesy, and I admit I'm curious how the puppies are doing. 7 is a large first litter." She set the groceries on Jackson's small kitchen counter and moved directly to Dakota, kneeling at a respectful distance. "How's Mama doing?" "Today good, I think," Jackson replied, closing the door. "Though the morning EST1 has trouble nursing sometimes." Natalie nodded, carefully examining each puppy while Dakota watched vigilantly. "That's normal with the runt. We may need to supplement her feedings." She looked up at Jackson. "Have you named them yet?" He shook his head. "Haven't thought about it well. They'll need names eventually, especially if you're going to find homes for them." Natalie finished her examination with a satisfied nod. "Everyone looks healthy, even the little one. Dakota's doing an excellent job for a first-time mom." She stood and moved to the groceries, unpacking eggs, bread, and coffee. "Mind if I make us both some breakfast? You look like you could use it again." Jackson found himself wrong-footed by the casual kindness. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Natalie replied, already rummaging through his cabinets for a pan, "but veterinarians need to eat too, and I hate eating alone." While she cooked, filling his cabin with the homey smells of brewing coffee and frying eggs, Jackson found himself watching her with curiosity. Dr. Natalie Brooks wasn't what he'd expected. Most people in Sunnydale treated him like a curiosity or a charity case, the damaged veteran who couldn't readjust to civilian life. Natalie treated him like a competent person who happened to need some help with a dog. "I heard Sinclair reported Dakota stolen," she said, handing him a plate of eggs and toast. "Leo Campbell mentioned it when I dropped by the station this morning." Jackson tensed. "Campbell told you? Small town," Natalie said with a shrug. "Leo and I went to high school together. Besides, I'm the one who called in the animal abandonment case." She took a sip of coffee. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Jackson admitted, legally, if she belongs to Sinclair, if he abandoned her to die, he forfeited any right to her. Natalie said firmly, "And those puppies were born under your roof. They've never been Sinclair's property." Jackson found. Himself warming to her directness, Campbell said Sinclair has influence in town, he does. Natalie acknowledged, but he's not untouchable. There are still laws against animal cruelty, even for the wealthy. Before Jackson could respond, a sharp knock sounded. At the door, Dakota growled softly. Positioning herself between the door and her puppies, Natalie and Jackson exchanged glances, expecting someone. She asked quietly. Jackson shook his head, moving to the window. His stomach tightened at the sight of 2 vehicles, a police cruiser and a sleek black SUV. Police, he said. And I'm guessing that's Sinclair. Natalie straightened her shoulders. Good thing I'm here then. A professional witness might be useful. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Jackson limped to the door, opening it to find Sergeant Campbell standing beside a tall, silver-haired man. In an expensive suit behind them, a younger officer waited by the vehicles. Mr. Reynolds, Campbell said, his expression professionally neutral. This is Mr. Edward Sinclair. He'd like to discuss the dog you found. Sinclair didn't wait for an invitation. Stepping forward to enter the cabin, Jackson stood his ground, blocking the doorway. Mr. Sinclair can discuss whatever he wants from right there, Jackson said evenly. Sinclair's cold, gray eyes assessed Jackson with obvious disdain. You have my property. Mr. Reynolds, a valuable breeding female that went missing 3 days ago. Abandoned. Jackson corrected, chained to a bridge during a flood. Sinclair waved a dismissive hand, a misunderstanding. One of my kennel staff was transporting her when she became aggressive. They secured her temporarily and went for appropriate restraints. By the time they returned, she was gone. The blatant lie made Jackson's jaw clench temporarily with a padlock chain. Mr. Reynolds, Campbell interjected. Mr. Sinclair has provided documentation showing ownership of a female German Shepherd matching the description of the dog you found. She has a name. Jackson said Dakota, and she gave birth to 7 puppies the night I rescued her. This information seemed to interest Sinclair, whose eyes narrowed calculatingly. All the more reason to return her immediately. Those puppies have significant value. Natalie appeared beside Jackson in the doorway. Dr. Natalie Brooks. She introduced herself. I've been providing medical care to Dakota, and her puppies. Moving a nursing mother and newborns would create serious health risks. Sinclair's smile didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Brooks, I wasn't aware you made house calls for animal abandonment cases. I make exceptions, she replied. Coolly, Campbell shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Sinclair has filed a formal complaint. I need to, at least verify the dog's identity. Jackson reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Campbell to enter. Sinclair moved to follow, but Jackson blocked him again. The officer can verify you stay outside. Sinclair's face flushed with anger. Do you know who I am? Someone who chains pregnant dogs to bridges. Jackson replied, his voice dangerously quiet. That's all I need to know. Campbell intervened before the confrontation could escalate. Miss Sinclair, please wait here. This will only take a moment inside. Campbell approached Dakota's wheeling box, slowly. The German Shepherd watched him wearily, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Easy, girl, Jackson said, limping over to kneel. Beside her, he's not going to take you anywhere. Campbell examined Dakota without touching her, noting the healing marks on her neck where the chain had cut into her. His gaze lingered on the puppies, then moved mauve to Jackson. She matches the description, he said quietly. Sinclair has AKC registration papers. She was abandoned. Jackson insisted left to drown. Campbell lowered his voice further. I believe you. But without evidence linking Sinclair directly to the abandonment, his ownership claim is legally sound. What about the chain, the padlock? No fingerprints, the rain washed everything clean. Campbell hesitated. I'm sorry, Reynolds. I don't have a choice here. Natalie joined them by the whelping box. The puppies are less than 72 hours old. Moving
them would be medically dangerous at minimum. They need 2 weeks of stability. Gamble seemed grateful for the potential compromise. I could explain that to Mr. Sinclair, a 2-week grace period for medical reasons, and then what Jackson demanded you.
Just hand them over to the man who tried to kill her. Before Campbell could answer, the door burst open. Sinclair entered, flanked by the younger officer who looked uncomfortable, but determined. This is taking too long. Sinclair announced, Officer Reed, please assist Mr. Reynolds in gathering my property. Dakota's growl deepened as Sinclair approached her body, curling protectively around her puppies. Jackson positioned himself between Dakota and the intruders, his combat instincts flaring back away. "From my dog," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a Marine who had commanded men in battle. Sinclair faltered momentarily, then recovered his arrogance. "Your dog. I have papers proving ownership and the law on my side." He turned. "To Campbell, Sergeant, I expect you to enforce my property rights." Campbell's expression was troubled. "Mr. Clare, Dr. Brooks has raised valid medical concerns about moving newborn puppies. Then I'll take the mother now in return for the puppies when they're weaned." Sinclair counted that would kill them. Natalie objected they need their mother's care and milk. Sinclair's patience visibly thinned. "Fine. I'll send my kennel manager to care for them here until they can be moved." "No," Jackson said simply. The room went still at his defiance. Sinclair's face darkened with anger. "Sergeant Campbell, either you remove my property from this man's possession or I'll call Chief Morgan and have you both disciplined for obstructing justice." Campbell looked pained. "Mr. Reynolds, please don't make this more difficult. I want to press charges," Jackson interrupted, "for animal cruelty and abandonment. DOA was chained to that bridge deliberately. Preposterous." Sinclair scoffed. "You have no evidence, actually," Natalie interjected. "I took detailed photos of Dakota's condition when I arrived. The pattern of injuries is consistent with being restrained by a heavy chain for several hours. I'd be happy to testify to that in court." Sinclair's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "A desperate attempt to steal valuable breeding stock my attorney will make. Short work of these accusations, the standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the smallest puppy." The runt began squeaking loudly, a high-pitched sound of distress that cut through the tension Dakota immediately turned her attention to, the struggling puppy nudging it closer with her nose. The simple act of maternal care seemed to affect everyone in the room. Campbell watched with something like resolve hardening in his expression. Even Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Sinclair's gaze. "Here's what's going to happen," Campbell said finally. "Due to the conflicting claims and medical concerns, Dakota and her puppies will remain here temporarily while we investigate the abandonment allegations." He held up a hand as Sinclair began to protest. "This is a compromise, Mr. Sinclair. The alternative is opening a formal animal cruelty investigation with the state authorities, which would involve a much more thorough examination of your breeding operation." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Sinclair's eyes darted between Campbell, Jackson, and Natalie, calculating his options. 2 weeks. He said finally, "Then I expect my property returned in full. All 7 puppies, and the mother." He turned to Jackson, his voice cold. "And if anything happens to any of them while in your care, I'll sue you for everything you have Mr. Reynolds with." That he turned and stalked out of the cab. Cabin Officer Reed followed. Looking relieved to escape the confrontation, Campbell remained, behind his expression troubled. "That won't be the end of it," he warned. "Sinclair doesn't like losing even temporarily." "Thank you," Jackson said. "Simply for buying us time." Campbell nodded, his gaze moving to Dakota and her puppies. "My grandmother raised German shepherds. Beautiful, intelligent animals, loyal to a fault." He looked back at Jackson. 2 weeks isn't much time to find a solution. "It's enough to gather evidence," Natalie offered. "If we can prove Sinclair abandoned Dakota, his ownership claim becomes void." "Proving it is the challenge," Campbell said. "But I'll look into his kennel operation more thoroughly. There might be something there." He moved toward the door. "Be careful. Reynolds Sinclair has friends in high place, FAS." After Campbell left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Jackson returned to Dakota's side, gently checking on the runt puppy, which had settled back to nursing. "What now?" he asked. Looking up at Natalie, she sank into a chair, her earlier composure giving way to visible concern. "We have 2 weeks to either find evidence against Sinclair or prepare a legal challenge to his ownership claim. And if we fail," Natalie's expression hardened with determination, "we won't. I've heard rumors about Sinclair's breeding operation. For years, too many puppies, too often with breeding females discarded when they're no longer profitable. Dakota might be our chance to expose all of it." Jackson looked down at Dakota, who gazed back at him with complete trust. In the 3 days since he'd rescued her, something had changed within him. The constant fog of depression and anxiety had lifted slightly, replaced by a clarity of purpose. he hadn't felt since his military service. I'm not letting him take her. Jackson said the decisions, cementing in his mind, or the puppies, it won't be easy. Natalie warned Sinclair practically owns this town. I've faced worse odds. Jackson's hand moved unconsciously to trace the scar on his leg, a remnant of the ambush that had ended his military career. Besides, I think we just found an ally in Sergeant Campbell. Natalie smiled slightly. Leo's a good man, straight as they come, even if he has to be careful around Sinclair. She stood and began gathering her things. I need to get to the clinic, but I'll start making calls, rescue organizations, legal contacts, anyone who might help. There are people who fight against operations like Sinclair's. As Natalie prepared to leave, Jackson walked her to the a door. Thank you, he said quietly, for breakfast. The medical help, everything. She paused, studying him with gentle assessment. You know, most people would have driven past that bridge in the storm or called someone else to handle it. You didn't. I couldn't leave her. Jackson said simply, that says something about you, Jackson Reynolds. She smiled again, this time with warmth that reached her eyes. I'll be back tomorrow to check on the puppies, start thinking of names for them. They deserve identities. Beyond property, after Natalie left Jackson, returned to Dakota's side, the German shepherd acknowledged him with a soft whine, then returned to tending her puppies. Jackson watched them, these small creatures who had unexpectedly given him a reason to fight again. Names, he said aloud, considering. Each puppy in turn, his eyes settled on the run, still struggling, but persistently finding her way back to. Nurse, whenever pushed aside by her siblings, Hope, he decided, for the smallest female. Your name is Hope. The rest of the day passed in a blur of feeding Dakota, monitoring the puppies and researching everything he could find about German shepherds. Whelping and puppy care on his rarely used laptop. By evening, he had named all 7 puppies. Storm, Bella, and Cole for the 3 darkest ones. Angel for the female with a white patch on her chest. Buddy and Scout for the 2 most active males, and Hope for the runt as darkness fell. Jackson checked his doors and windows, setting up makeshift alarms, strings attached to cans of nails at each potential entry. Point combat habits died hard, and Campbell's warning about Sinclair lingered in his mind. He made a simple dinner, setting aside some plain chicken for Dakota, who accepted it gratefully. The quiet domesticity of caring for another living being settled over him like a forgotten blanket, warm and comforting. Just as he was preparing for bed, his phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar local number. Hello? He answered cautiously. Reynolds. It's Campbell. The officer's voice was tight with urgency. I've been looking into Sinclair's operation. There's something you should know. Jackson glanced at Dakota, instantly alert. What is it? Dakota isn't the first dog to disappear from Sinclair's breeding program. I've found records of at least 6 females reported sold or transferred in the past 2 years, all shortly before they would have been bred again. What happened to them? Campbell's voice lowered. That's what I'm trying to find out. But there's a pattern. A female produces 2 or 3 litters, then vanishes from the records. He discards them. Jackson said, the realization turning. His stomach looks that way. Listen, I've got a contact at the state agricultural department. He's agreed to inspect Sinclair's facility tomorrow on an anonymous tip. If we find violations, it would undermine his ownership claim. Jackson finished exactly, but Reynolds. Campbell paused. Be careful tonight. Word around the station is that Sinclair is furious. He's not used to being challenged after hanging up. Jackson completed his security preparations with renewed vigilance. He made a bed on the floor, near Dakota's whelping box, unwilling to sleep in his bedroom room with potential threats looming. Dakota watched him settle down, then surprised him by carefully picking up the runt Hope in her mouth and placing the tiny puppy beside Jackson's hand. She looked at him expectantly. You want me to keep her warm? Jackson asked, gently lifting the small puppy. Dakota returned to the whelping box, seemingly satisfied that her smallest offspring was in safe hands. Jackson cradled Hope against his chest, marveling at how something so small could already have such a distinct personality, determined despite her disadvantages, fighting for her place in the world. We allot, Al. Like Hope, he whispered, stroking her velvet soft head with one finger, both of us struggling to find our way. The puppy squirmed, then settled against his warmth, falling asleep with complete trust. Jackson's last thought before drifting off was that for the first time since returning from combat, he had something that truly needed his protection. Something that made his hypervigilance and tactical skills assets rather than liabilities. Dakota and her puppies had given him purpose again. In the darkness outside, a vehicle approached silently, its headlights extinguished. As it neared the cabin, two figures emerged, moving with practiced stealth toward Jackson's home. Jackson woke instantly to the sound of metal scraping against his front door lock. Years of combat training had honed his senses. He could distinguish between ordinary night sounds and potential threats, even in sleep. This was definitely the latter. Dakota was already alert, her ears forward, a low growl rumbling in her throat. The other puppies slept peacefully in their whelping box, but hope remained, curled against Jackson's chest where she had fallen asleep, setting the tiny puppy gently back with her siblings. Jackson moved silently to the window, staying in the shadows. Two figures stood on his porch, one working at the lock, while the other kept watch, though their faces were hidden by dark hoodies. Their body language suggested professional confidence. These weren't random burglars. Jackson's mind raced through his options. His shotgun was in the bedroom, too far to reach without making noise. Calling the police would take too long. The intruders would be inside before help arrived. That left confrontation as the only viable choice. The lock clicked. Jackson positioned himself behind the door as it began to swing open, then drove his shoulder into it with full force. The door slammed into the first intruder, sending him stumbling backward into his partner. Both men tumbled off the porch onto the ground. Jackson followed, ignoring the pain flaring in his bad leg. One intruder was already scrambling to his feet, pulling something from his waistband. Jackson didn't hesitate. He drove his fist into the man's solar plexus, then delivered a precise strike to his throat that left him gasping on the ground. The second intruder was quicker, managing to draw a taser. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice muffled behind a balaclava. Jackson assessed the threat with cold precision. The man's stance was amateur, his grip on the weapon uncertain. Jackson feinted left, then drove forward as the man discharged the ice taser into empty air. A quick sweep of the legs brought the intruder down hard. Jackson pinned him, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency. "Who sent you?" Jackson demanded, applying precisely calibrated pressure. The man struggled briefly before pain forced him to stillness. "Just following orders," he gasped. "Sinclair's orders?" Jackson pressed. The man's silence was confirmation enough. Jackson increased the pressure slightly. "What were you supposed to do?" "Take the dog," the man admitted through gritted teeth. "And the puppies, get them back to Mr. Sinclair." A surge of anger rushed through Jackson. He thought of Dakota, of Hope and her siblings, of what might have happened if he hadn't woken in time. "Listen carefully," Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet. "Tell Sinclair that if he sends anyone else to my property, they won't walk away. Dakota and her puppies stay with me. Understood?" The man nodded frantically. Jackson released him, stepping back but remaining alert. "Get your friend and go." Now the two intruders retreated hastily to a black SUV park just beyond Jackson's driveway. As they drove away, Jackson memorized the license plate number, then returned to the cabin, securing the damaged lock as best he could. Dakota was standing protectively over her puppies, her intelligent eyes following Jackson's movements. "It's okay," he assured her, kneeling to check on the puppies. "They're gone, we're safe." But even as he spoke the words, Jackson knew this was just the beginning. Sinclair had escalated from legal threats to attempted theft. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The 2 grace period Campbell had negotiated suddenly seemed much less secure. Jackson reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing Natalie's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Jackson, what's wrong?" "Sinclair sent men to take Dakota and the puppies," he said tersely. "I stopped them, but they'll be back." Natalie was instantly alert. "Are you okay? Are the puppies safe?" "We're fine for now, but I need to move them somewhere safer." There was a brief silence as Natalie considered. "My clinic has security cameras and an alarm system. You could bring them there temporarily. I don't want to put you at risk. I'm already involved." Natalie counted. Besides having them at a veterinary facility creates another legal buffer. Sinclair would have to explain why he removing animals from medical care. Jackson weighed the options and found her logic sound. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, moving Dakota and 7 newborn puppies. Prov challenging. Jackson constructed a makeshift carrier from a large plastic storage container, lining it with blankets. Dakota was initially reluctant to enter the strange enclosure, but when Jackson placed her puppies inside, her maternal instinct overrode a cow. The drive to Sunnydale Veterinary Clinic was tense. Jackson constantly checking his rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. Dakota lay curled around her puppies in the container secured on the passenger seat, occasionally whining softly. Almost there. Jackson reassured her, navigating the deserted pre-dawn streets. Natalie was waiting at the clinic's back entrance, hastily dressed in jeans and a sweater. Her auburn hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She helped Jackson carry the container inside, leading him to a spacious treatment room where she'd already prepared a comfortable bedding area. "This is more secure than the kennel area," she explained as Dakota and her puppies settled into their new surroundings. "Only staff can access it, and we can lock it from inside." Jackson surveyed the room. 1 door, 2 windows with blinds, medical equipment neatly organized on counters. "It'll do for now," he agreed. "But this isn't a long-term solution." Natalie disappeared briefly, returning with 2 cups of coffee. "No, it isn't," she agreed, handing him a steaming mug, "but it buys us time to figure out our next steps." She perched on a stool, watching as Jackson checked each puppy methodically before sitting on the floor beside Dakota the German. Shepherd rested her head on his leg, sighing contentedly despite the unfamiliar surroundings. "You should call Campbell," Natalie suggested. "Report the break-in." Jackson's expression hardened. "With what proof? They wore masks and gloves." "It would be my word against Sinclair's, and we already know which one carries more weight in this town. Still, establishing a pattern of harassment helps our case." Jackson nodded reluctantly. "I'll call him in the morning." He sipped his coffee, feeling the adrenaline of the confrontation finally begin to subside. "Thank you for this," he added quietly. Natalie smiled, moving to check on the puppies while Jackson secured the cottage's doors and windows outside. The night was alive with normal forest sounds, reassuring in their ordinariness. Jackson peered through the cracked curtains at the star-filled sky, thinking about how far they'd come since that stormy night on the bridge. Dakota had gone from abandoned and dying to the center of a community's fight against corruption and cruelty. He had gone from isolated and purposeless to reconnected with a world he'd withdrawn from after his injuries. Whatever happened next, whether Campbell's evidence was enough to finally bring Sinclair to justice, whether the court recognized Dakota's right to remain with those who had saved her, Jackson knew one thing. With absolute certainty, he would never again retreat from life the way he had before Dakota entered it. For now, though, in this hidden cottage with Natalie's quiet presence and Dakota's watchful protection of her puppies, there was a moment of peace, a breath before the final confrontation that would determine all their futures. Jackson settled on the floor near Dakota's bed, reaching out to stroke her head, gently. "Get some rest," he told her. "Tomorrow's a big day." Dakota sighed, contentedly leaning into his touch, her trust so hard won after her ordeal remained. Jackson's most precious achievement, worth any risk, any sacrifice that might still lie ahead. Dawn broke over Martha Wilson's farm painting, the caretaker's cottage in soft golden light. Jackson had been awake for hours, vigilant despite his exhaustion. Natalie slept on a narrow cot in the corner, while Dakota and her puppies rested peacefully in their makeshift bed. His phone vibrated with a text from Campbell Johnson's statement. Recorded state prosecutor interested. "Stay where you are." Tentative hope kindled in Jackson's chest. Perhaps there would be a legal resolution after all, one that secured Dakota's future, without requiring desperate measures. The sound of tires on gravel snapped him to alertness, peering cautiously through the curtains. He relaxed at the sight of Martha's pickup truck approaching. The elderly farmer carried a basket of supplies, fresh bread, eggs, coffee, and a newspaper tucked under her arm. "Thought you could use some breakfast," she said by way of greeting, setting the basket on the small kitchen table. "And you should see this." She handed Jackson the Sunnydale Gazette. The front page headline made his breath catch. "Sinclair employee arrested. Alleges criminal animal abuse." "It's already public," Jackson said, scanning the article. How Martha's eyes twinkled. Small towns have big ears, and not everyone at the Gazette is in Sinclair's pocket. The article detailed Johnson's arrest and his allegations that Sinclair had ordered Dakota's abandonment and the subsequent break-in at the veterinary clinic. It mentioned the state prosecutor's interest and the potential for criminal charges. "This changes everything," Natalie said, awakened by their voices. Sinclair can't make this disappear now that it's public. Martha wasn't quite so optimistic. Don't underestimate him when he's cornered. That's when men like Edward Sinclair are most dangerous. Her warning proved pre-ent by mid-M morning arrived with troubling news. Johnson's recanted his statement. He announced grimly claims he was coerced, that we threatened him to make allegations against Sinclair. That's absurd. Natalie protested. You had multiple witnesses. Sinclair got to him somehow, Campbell replied. Threats, bribes, who knows, but it gets worse. Chief Morgan has suspended me pending an investigation into misconduct and witness intimidation. Jackson absorbed this setback, his mind working through implications. The hearing is still tomorrow. Campbell nodded. With Judge Peterson, without Johnson's testimony, or my ability to present evidence as an officer, our case is severely weakened. What about the veterinary records? Natalie asked. Sinclair's lawyer is claiming they're forgeries, without someone from inside the operation to authenticate them. The site situation seemed to be deteriorating by the hour. Jackson excused himself, stepping outside for a moment alone. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant water. He stared across Martha's fields, weighing options and outcomes. His phone rang, an unknown number, weary but curious. He answered. Mr. Reynolds, a hesitant male voice. Asked, You don't know me, but I work at Sinclair's breeding facility. I heard what happened, with Peter Johnson. Jackson's attention sharpened. Who am I speaking with? That's not important. What matters is I can verify those veterinary records are authentic. I was the one who sent them to Dr. Brooks. Why are you calling me now? A pause. Because I saw what Sinclair did to Dakota. She was one of our best mothers, gentle with her puppies when she got too old for breeding. I was told she'd be placed with a family. The caller voice hardened. Instead, Sinclair ordered her chained to that bridge. I can't be silent anymore. We need your testimony, Jackson urged. Without it, I know that's why.